hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. Emma stood on the balcony of her apartment, sipping lukewarm tea as she watched the city slowly transform under the veil of dusk. Her apartment was on the 7th floor of a building nestled in the quieter part of town, where the hum of traffic was a distant murmur, and the streets below were dimly lit by flickering lampposts. Emma had always preferred solitude. Her days were spent working at a small publishing house, her evenings divided between reading and sketching in her quiet sanctuary. It wasn't that she disliked people. She simply found peace in her own company. The city offered her anonymity, the ability to blend into the crowd, unnoticed and unbothered. It was comforting, in a way, to be invisible. But recently, the comfort had begun to erode. It started with small, almost imperceptible occurrences, things she could easily rationalize if she tried hard enough. A missed call from an unknown number that rang only once before stopping. An odd feeling of being watched as she walked home from the bus stop late at night. Once, she noticed a single cigarette butt resting on the balcony rail, still faintly smoldering. She didn't smoke, and her immediate thought was that the wind had carried it from another balcony, though it struck her as odd nonetheless. Then there were the footsteps. Her apartment building was old, with narrow hallways and thin walls that carried sound easily. She had grown used to the muffled noises of neighbors going about their routines, but these footsteps were different. They were deliberate, slow, and heavy, always in the hallway outside her apartment, always late at night. She would freeze in her bed, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened to the sound drawing closer, only for it to stop just outside her door. She never dared to get up and look. One evening, as Emma stepped off the elevator and walked toward her door, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. A small crumpled note had been slipped under her door. She paused, staring at it for a long moment before leaning down to pick it up. The paper was rough, torn from a notebook, and the handwriting was uneven, almost childlike. The note contained only 4 words. "I like your drawings." Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what was worse: the fact that someone had been close enough to slip the note under her door, or that they knew about her drawings. Her sketches were private, kept in a journal she never showed to anyone. The idea that someone had seen them made her skin crawl. That night, she locked every window and door, pulling the heavy curtains tightly shut. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the building setting her nerves on edge. When she finally drifted off, her dreams were filled with shadowy figures and whispered voices. The next morning, she tried to shake off the unease. She convinced herself that the note was a prank, a harmless joke from a neighbor who had somehow seen her sketching on the balcony. But as the days passed, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. She began to notice the same man at the bus stop every morning, standing just a little too close, his eyes lingering on her for just a little too long. He never spoke, never acknowledged her, but his presence was impossible to ignore. She started taking a different route to work, catching an earlier bus, but the man seemed to follow her wherever she went. He was always there, his expression blank, but his gaze unwavering. She told herself she was being paranoid, that he was just another commuter with a similar schedule, but the pit in her stomach refused to subside. One evening, after a long day at work, Emma decided to stop by the grocery store before heading home. The aisles were nearly empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly as she moved through the store, methodically crossing items off her list. She was in the canned goods aisle when she saw him. He was standing at the other end of the aisle, pretending to examine a can of soup, but his eyes were fixed on her. Her chest tightened as she quickly turned and headed for the checkout, abandoning the rest of her list. She felt his presence behind her as she paid for her items, The cool night air did little to calm her nerves. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, but the sidewalk was empty. The walk home was eerily quiet. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the sound of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, but every time she turned around, the street behind her was empty. By the time she reached her apartment, her heart was racing, and she locked the door behind her with shaking hands. That night, she woke to the sound of someone tapping on the balcony door. The sound was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder and more insistent. Her bedroom faced the opposite side of the apartment, but she could hear it clearly. The steady, deliberate tapping sent a chill down her spine. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it and dialed the building's security office. The line rang twice before a groggy voice answered. Emma explained the situation, her voice hushed but urgent. The guard assured her he would check the security cameras and call her back. She sat on the edge of the bed, her heart pounding as she waited for the phone to ring. The tapping stopped, replaced by an unsettling silence that was somehow worse. Minutes felt like hours, and when her phone finally buzzed, she nearly dropped it in her haste to answer. "There's no one on the balcony," the guard said. "The cameras don't show anything unusual. Are you sure you heard something?" Emma's throat tightened. She thanked him and hung up, the unease settling over her like a heavy blanket. She couldn't explain the sound, but she knew she hadn't imagined it. The next morning, she found another note slipped under her door. This one was shorter, written in the same jagged handwriting. "I was there." Emma's world tilted as a cold wave of fear washed over her. She clutched the note in her trembling hands, her mind racing. Someone had been on her balcony. Someone had watched her through the glass, unseen, and left without a trace. She couldn't pretend it was her imagination anymore. Emma sat frozen on her couch, the crumpled note still clenched tightly in her hand. The words stared back at her like a cruel joke. "I was there." She read them over and over, hoping they'd change, hoping she'd wake up and discover this was just another vivid nightmare. But the chill in the air, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the distant sounds of the city outside confirmed the harsh reality. Her gaze drifted toward the balcony door, where the morning light struggled to penetrate the heavy curtains she had pulled shut. It felt as though the outside world had crept too close, its shadows pressing against the thin glass. For the first time, her sanctuary no longer felt safe. Every corner of the apartment seemed to hold a secret. Every sound carried a hidden threat. She moved to her phone and dialed the building's management office. Her voice was shaky as she explained the notes and the strange tapping from the night before. The woman on the other end sounded concerned, but offered little reassurance. "We'll increase the patrols," the woman said, though her tone lacked conviction. "Have you considered contacting the police?" Emma hesitated. What could she tell them? That someone had been on her balcony without leaving any evidence. That she was being followed but had no proof. She had no name, no face, only a growing sense of dread that something was very wrong. After a long pause, she thanked the woman and hung up, feeling even more isolated than before. The day passed in a haze. Emma tried to distract herself by cleaning, reorganizing her bookshelves, even sketching, but her usual calm eluded her. The shadows seemed to stretch farther into the room, and every time she looked at the balcony door, she half expected to see someone standing there, watching her from behind the glass. By evening, her nerves were frayed. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow across the apartment. She debated leaving, maybe staying with a friend for a few days, but the thought of walking alone to the bus stop made her stomach churn. Instead, she locked every door and window, double-checked the deadbolt, and slid a chair under the doorknob for good measure. As the night deepened, the oppressive silence of the apartment grew heavier. Emma lay on the couch, her phone clutched in her hand, scrolling through articles about stalkers and home invasions. Every story seemed to mirror her fears, each one ending with a resolution that felt just out of reach. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, but the thought of turning it off and being alone in the dark was unbearable. Around midnight, the tapping started again. It was faint at first, a soft, almost polite knock against the glass. Emma froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound was steady, deliberate, as though whoever or whatever was outside wanted her to know they were there. She forced herself to sit up, her body trembling as she turned to face the balcony door. The curtains swayed gently, even though the windows were closed. She stared at them, willing the tapping to stop, but it only grew louder, more insistent. Her phone buzzed in her hand, startling her so badly that she nearly dropped it. She glanced down and saw a notification from the building's security app. The message was brief. Motion detected. Balcony. Her blood ran cold. She tapped on the notification, opening the app to the live camera feed. The image was grainy, the view distorted by the faint glow of the nearby streetlights, but it was unmistakable. There was someone on her balcony. A tall figure, their face obscured, stood motionless just outside the glass. The figure didn't move, didn't try to hide. They just stood there, as if waiting. Emma's breath hitched as the figure raised a hand and tapped on the glass again, the sound crisp and sharp through the still night. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from the door, her mind racing. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. The figure shifted slightly, their head tilting as though they could see her through the curtains. Emma's phone buzzed again, and she glanced down, expecting another notification. Instead, she saw a text message from an unknown number. "Why don't you come outside?" Her stomach twisted, a wave of nausea washing over her. She stared at the screen, her fingers trembling as she tried to process what was happening. How did they have her number? How long had they been watching her? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was thick and suffocating, pressing against her ears like a tangible force. She held her breath, straining to hear anything, footsteps, movement, even the distant hum of the city, but there was nothing. Suddenly, the sound of her phone ringing shattered the stillness. The screen lit up with another unknown number. Emma stared at it, her heart pounding. She didn't want to answer, but the thought of ignoring it was somehow worse. With trembling hands, she swiped to accept the call and pressed the phone to her ear. "Hello," she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was no response, just the faint sound of breathing on the other end. It was slow and deliberate, each breath dragging out as if to mock her silence. She pulled the phone away, staring at the screen in horror, before ending the call and blocking the number. She turned toward the balcony door, her pulse racing. The curtains were still, and the streetlights outside cast distorted shadows across the room. Gathering what little courage she had, she crept toward the door and pulled the curtains aside just enough to peek outside. The balcony was empty. Emma's relief was short-lived. As she let the curtain fall back into place, her eyes caught something she hadn't noticed before. A single smudge on the glass, shaped like a handprint. It was faint, but unmistakable, the greasy outline glistening in the dim light. She stumbled back, her mind reeling. Whoever had been there was gone now, but they had been close, too close. The handprint felt like a mark, a warning, a reminder that she wasn't alone. She backed into the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, and sank to the floor, corners of her mind. Emma stayed on the floor, her back pressed against the couch, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles ached. The handprint on the glass burned in her mind, a grim reminder of how close the intruder had been. The silence in her apartment was deafening, the kind of silence that felt alive, thick and oppressive, as though it were watching her. She didn't dare move, didn't dare even breathe too loudly. Every shadow seemed to stretch further, every creak of the floorboards a sinister whisper. The tapping returned, faint at first, so soft she almost convinced herself she was imagining it. But it grew louder, more insistent, echoing in the stillness. This time, it wasn't coming from the balcony. It was coming from inside the apartment. Emma's heart stopped. The sound was deliberate, rhythmic, and impossibly close, coming from the hallway leading to her bedroom. Her breath caught in her throat as she strained to listen. The tapping didn't stop. It echoed, each knock slow and methodical, like a predator toying with its prey. She wanted to move, to run to the door and flee the apartment, but her legs refused to obey. She stared at the hallway, her flashlight still on the floor beside her. The shadows there were darker, deeper, and they seemed to ripple unnaturally, like waves on a blackened sea. The phone in her hand buzzed again. She jumped, nearly dropping it, and glanced at the screen. Another message from an unknown number. "You locked the door." Smart. Her stomach churned. They were inside. Somehow, they were inside. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the flashlight and backing toward the front door. Her fingers fumbled with the locks as she tried to undo them, but her hands were shaking too much to grip the latch. The tapping in the hallway stopped, replaced by the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Emma froze, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and they were getting closer. Her hand flew to her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. The line rang once, twice, before a calm voice answered. 911, what is your emergency? Emma struggled to find her voice. Someone's in my apartment, she whispered, her words tumbling out in a rush. They're inside, and I don't know how. The footsteps stopped. Dead silence filled the air, so absolute it felt like the apartment itself was holding its breath. Emma pressed herself against the door, clutching the phone to her ear as she waited for the operator's response. But the voice on the other end was no longer calm. Emma, it said. Her name, spoken softly, slowly, dripping with malice. Her stomach dropped. It wasn't the operator anymore. It was them. The phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor as the sound of breathing filled the line. Heavy, labored breathing, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The lights flickered. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting so fast that her breath became visible in the dim light. The shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and writhing like living things. Emma's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but every shadow seemed to close in on her, stretching toward her like blackened claws. And then she saw it. A figure stepped into the faint glow of the living room, emerging from the hallway like a phantom made flesh. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and skeletal, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its face was obscured, shrouded in darkness, but its presence was suffocating. Emma couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The room seemed to shrink around her, the walls closing in as the figure took a step closer. The flashlight in her hand flickered, casting erratic beams of light that barely illuminated the figure. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its head twitching as though it were trying to see her better. Emma pressed herself harder against the door, her mind racing for a way out. The figure stopped, its head tilting even further to the side. shadows around it seemed to pulse and throb, as though feeding off its presence. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, it spoke. "Why do you run?" The words sent a chill through her, colder than anything she'd ever felt. They were spoken directly into her mind, bypassing her ears entirely. Her vision blurred, tears streaming down her face as she gripped the doorknob with all her strength. The figure moved again, its movement slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment. The room felt darker, the air heavier, as though the apartment itself was complicit in her terror. And then the figure stopped, just a few feet away, its head tilting so far that it seemed on the verge of snapping. Emma's shaking hands finally managed to twist the lock. She flung the door open and stumbled into the hallway, the bright fluorescent light stinging her eyes. She ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold tile floor, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The elevator seemed a mile away, but she reached it, slamming her fist against the call button. The soft ding of the doors opening felt like salvation, and she darted inside, pressing the button for the lobby. As the doors slid shut, she caught a glimpse of her apartment door at the end of the hallway. It was wide open, the darkness inside spilling out like ink, and in that darkness, she saw the figure standing perfectly still. The ride down was agonizingly slow. Emma pressed herself into the corner of the elevator, her heart hammering in her chest as she stared at the glowing numbers above the door. When the doors finally opened, she ran into the lobby, her voice hoarse as she called for help. The night guard on duty looked up from his desk, startled. "What's going on?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Emma tried to explain, but her words came out in frantic bursts, incoherent and broken. The guard grabbed his flashlight and followed her back to the elevator, his expression a mix of concern and skepticism. They rode up in silence, the hum of the elevator the only sound. When they reached her floor, the hallway was empty. Her apartment door was shut, the locks intact. The guard checked every room, every corner, but there was no sign of an intruder. The handprint on the balcony glass was gone, as though it had never been there. "You're safe," the guard said, though his tone was more reassuring than confident. "But I'll stay on this floor for the rest of the night, just in case." Emma nodded numbly, too drained to argue. As she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty hallway outside, a single thought consumed her. The figure hadn't needed to break in. It had always been inside,